The gate of Jerusalem groaned under the weight of the mourning throng. Thousands pressed forward, a river of humanity surging toward the temple. Jeremiah stood at the threshold, a clay jar held high above his head. He did not speak, he did not wait. He swung his arms downward with every ounce of his strength. The jar connected with the stone floor, exploding into 100 jagged fragments that skittered across the pavement. The sound cut through the roar of the crowd like a blade. People stopped. The momentum of the mass stalled, then broke. Jeremiah pointed to the city walls, his voice rising above the sudden, heavy silence. "This city will be broken," he shouted, "just like this clay, never to be made whole again." The air shifted. The indifference of the crowd vanished, replaced by a sharp, cold edge of hostility. Faces turned toward him, eyes narrowing. The first stones were lifted from the ground, knuckles white with grip. Jeremiah did not move. He stood amidst the pottery shards, watching the wall of people tighten around him, waiting for the inevitable surge. The crowd surged forward, a tide of hands and shouting voices. Before Jeremiah could draw another breath, he was seized. He felt fingers dig into his arms, dragging him backward through the dust toward the inner temple court. Pashur the priest stood waiting, his face a mask of cold fury. He stepped forward and struck Jeremiah across the face, the impact snapping his head to the side. The taste of salt and iron flooded his mouth. He was shoved toward the upper gate, where the heavy wooden frame of the stocks stood ready. They forced his wrists and ankles into the slots. The iron bolts slammed home with a final, echoing thud. The mob dispersed, leaving him alone in the growing darkness. The night air bit into his skin. He braced his back against the freezing metal, but there was no relief. His legs began to cramp, the muscles drawing tight as he tried to shift his weight. He stared into the blackness of the courtyard, listening to the slow, rhythmic drip of water somewhere in the distance. Every breath was a struggle against the stillness. He did not cry out. He simply waited for the sun to rise, his body locked in the unyielding grip of the iron. The morning light brought no mercy. Pashur ordered the bolts drawn back, and Jeremiah fell forward, his limbs stiff and shaking. He did not retreat. He stood, wiped the grit from his face, and walked straight back into the square. The people gathered, their murmurs rising like a swarm of insects. He raised his voice, clear and steady, telling them they carried a lie in their hearts, a path toward their own destruction. The guards did not wait for a command this time. They swarmed him, dragging him from the square toward the outer perimeter. They reached a deep, dark cistern. The cover was shoved aside, revealing a jagged, black throat in the earth. They shoved him over the edge. He hit the bottom with a sickening thud, the breath driven from his lungs. There was no water, only thick, stagnant, black mud that clung to his skin. He tried to stand, but his feet sank deeper with every movement. He reached out, his fingers clawing at the slimy stone walls, but they offered no purchase. He sank to his knees. The darkness pressed against his eyes. Above him, the circle of sky was a tiny, unreachable pinprick of light. He was alone, and the mud began to swallow his strength. Days bled into a singular, suffocating weight. Jeremiah sat in the dark, the mud having seeped into his bones. His energy was spent. He stared at the distant circle of light, his vision blurring, waiting for the end. Then, the light shifted. A silhouette blocked the opening, followed by the clatter of heavy rope against stone. A voice called out, muffled and distant, but distinct. He did not have the strength to shout back. He watched as a bundle of worn cloth descended, dropping into the muck beside him. He understood. With trembling hands, he dragged the rags beneath his armpits, weaving the fabric through the coarse fibers of the rope. He gave a sharp tug. Above, the men braced. The rope went taut, biting into his skin. He was hauled upward, his feet dragging against the slimy wall. The air changed from the stale, dead scent of the pit to the sharp, cool bite of the surface. He felt the rim of the cistern beneath his fingers. He lunged, his nails scraping the dirt, and pulled himself over the edge. He collapsed onto the solid ground, his chest heaving, the light of the sky burning his eyes. He stayed there, gasping, anchored to the earth once more. Jeremiah did not return to his home. He walked through the palace gates, his presence a jarring intrusion of filth against the polished stone. He pushed past the guards, who recoiled from the smell of the cistern. He found King Zedekiah in the private chamber, surrounded by maps and scrolls that no longer held meaning. Jeremiah stopped, his shadow stretching across the floor. He spoke without hesitation, his voice raspy from the dark. "Surrender the city," he demanded. "Save your people, save your own life, and let the walls fall." The king stood by the window, his fingers gripping the sill so hard the knuckles turned white. He turned, his face pale, his jaw working as he tried to find a reply. He did not speak, but the tremor in his hands betrayed him. He looked at the city walls, then back at the prophet, his eyes darting with frantic indecision. The room grew heavy with the weight of his silence. Jeremiah waited, but the command to surrender never came. The king sank into his chair, his head bowing, the decision slipping through his fingers like sand. The moment of salvation passed, leaving only the inevitable. The silence in the palace was short-lived. A low, rhythmic vibration traveled through the floor, rhythmic and heavy. It was the sound of iron striking stone. Jeremiah walked to the balcony, his feet steady against the tremors. Beyond the guard court, the horizon was thick with dust. The impact of the battering ram sounded like thunder, a cadence of destruction that shook the foundations of the city. He watched the main gate. The heavy timber groaned, splintered, and gave way. Then, the stone wall above it shuddered. A hairline fracture raced across the masonry, branching out like a bolt of lightning. The mortar crumbled, pouring down in a gray cascade. The wall did not just crack, it surged outward. A massive section of the fortification buckled and tilted, gravity finally reclaiming the stone. With a roar that drowned out the shouting in the streets, the rampart collapsed. A cloud of pulverized rock and ancient dust billowed upward, swallowing the afternoon light. The barrier that had protected the city for generations was gone, reduced to a jagged, broken ridge of rubble. The path was open. The end had arrived. The breach was a floodgate. Soldiers poured through the gap in the wall, their iron weapons glinting in the rising dust. They did not move like men. They moved like a tide, washing over the streets and surging toward the center of the city. Jeremiah stood at the edge of the guard court as the first torches were thrown. The flames caught the dry market stalls instantly, turning the narrow alleys into chimneys of heat. He watched as the palace, the seat of the throne, began to groan. First, the roof beams groaned under the weight of fire. Then the central pillars buckled. The structure groaned, swayed, and tilted toward the courtyard. With a deafening crack of splintering wood and stone, the roof collapsed into the main hall. A massive plume of black, oily smoke erupted from the center of the city, rising to choke the sky. Fire jumped from roof to roof, consuming everything in its path. The sound of the city was no longer the sound of life, but the roar of a furnace. Buildings crumbled into piles of hot ash. The city was being erased, feature by feature, wall by wall, until there was nothing left but the heat and the flickering, hungry orange light. Jeremiah moved to the main gate, stepping over the debris of what was once the city entrance. The fire had turned the air into a thick, choking haze, but he kept his eyes on the road. The survivors were being driven out of their homes. They emerged from the smoke, heads bowed, their hands bound behind their backs with heavy iron links. The sound was rhythmic and cruel. Each step forward brought the metallic clink of chains against the cobblestones, a dull, repetitive percussion that echoed against the ruined walls. He watched the lines lengthen. Mothers pulled their children toward the desert, flanked by soldiers who moved with impatient, sharp gestures. No one looked back. The pride of the city was gone, replaced by the slow, shuffling gait of captives. Jeremiah stood motionless as the procession passed him. He counted the rows of people, their feet leaving dark, dragging marks in the ash of the street. The sun hung low, casting long, distorted shadows of the prisoners across the broken earth. They reached the threshold, crossed the line of the wall, and vanished into the gray horizon. The city was finally quiet, save for the fading rattle of their bonds. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing down on the jagged teeth of broken walls. Jeremiah turned away from the gate. He navigated the cooling mounds of rubble, his boots crunching on pulverized limestone and glass. He stopped near a section of the city wall that had partially survived the fire. The stones were scorched black, smelling of damp earth and burnt timber. He knelt in the dust, his hands sifting through the debris until his fingers brushed against a smooth, dark fragment of charcoal. He picked it up. It left a dark stain on his skin. He pulled a dry, brittle sheet of parchment from his side. He flattened it against the rough surface of a fallen block. The quill was gone, but the charcoal held. He pressed the tip to the surface, feeling the slight resistance of the material. He began to draw lines, forming marks that would outlast the stone. He did not look at the city anymore. He focused only on the parchment, his hand moving in steady, deliberate motions. With every stroke, the chaos of the day was distilled into a single, permanent record. He ignored the cooling wind and the lingering smoke. He wrote until the parchment was filled, turning the wreckage of his world into a testament of what had been lost. Jeremiah finished the last sentence. He pressed the charcoal firmly into the parchment, then set it down on the stone. He blew away the excess dust that had settled on the surface. The ink-black marks stood out against the pale, dried skin of the scroll. He waited for the wind to lift the edges, but the air remained still. He picked up the parchment, rolling it slowly until it was a tight, compact cylinder. He tucked it safely under his arm. He stood up, his joints stiff from the hours spent kneeling in the grit. He looked around. The houses were hollow shells, their doors hanging off broken hinges. The streets were empty of voices, footsteps, or the cries of the market. Only the wind moved, whistling through the gaps in the fractured masonry. He took a breath of the cooling, ash-filled air and turned his back on the ruins. He stepped over a pile of scattered timber and began to walk. His boots made a rhythmic crunching sound on the debris, the only noise in the city. He did not glance back at the place where his life had been built. He reached the city limits, crossed the threshold of the broken gate, and kept walking until he was nothing more than a silhouette against the vast, darkening horizon.